Hey guys, Pastor Tim here. Hope you're ready for another video from our youth group at Lighthouse Baptist Church. If this is your first time watching a video or you're trying to catch up on a missed lesson, we hope that this video is a blessing to you and helps you grow in your relationship with Jesus Christ.
2 Corinthians chapter 5, and we're going to read chapter 2, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, we're going to read verse 5 to 11. All right. Verse 5 says, "But if any have caused grief, he hath not grieved me, but in part, that I may not overcharge you all. Sufficient to such a man is the punishment which was inflicted of many. So that, contrariwise, ye ought rather to forgive him," and that's where our main idea for this lesson comes from, "and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow." So, in case you want to know the context, Paul is speaking of someone in the church of Corinth that quite possibly was someone alluded to in the first letter to Corinthians. But regardless, he's referring to someone that obviously has committed some sort of sin or offense to maybe not just one, but maybe a number of people in the church. He has been dealt with. He has had, he's suffered the consequences for that. He's gone through church discipline, whatever it may have been. And he's kind of telling them, all right, so verse 7, "So that contrariwise ye ought rather to forgive him and comfort him," saying, all right, now is not the time to continue to just ostracize him, like put him out. No, he's already been dealt with. He's already asked forgiveness. He's repented. Ye ought to then forgive. All right, that's kind of the idea of what we're talking about tonight. "So that contrariwise ye ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow." So the idea there is because no one's really living like they forgave him, all right, it just continues to be a burden and a stress upon him, and he gets swallowed up with that grief and sorrow he has. "Wherefore I beseech you," verse 8, "wherefore I beseech you that ye would confirm your love toward him, for to this end also did I write, that I might know the proof of you, whether ye be obedient in all things. To whom ye forgive anything, I forgive also. For if I forgave anything, to whom I forgave it, for your sakes forgave I it in the person of Christ." All right? "Lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices." So he's kind of alluding to the fact there that if you are not apt to forgive, you're not willing to forgive, you're kind of setting yourself up, because that's going to affect your spirit. Right? You're setting yourself up to possibly be deceived by Satan. Okay? So as we get into this lesson, just kind of think about that, why it's important to forgive, all right, and how that's going to play out in your life. And you guys understand this whole series is not what you think. It's taking how the world usually thinks, or how the world would usually respond to certain situations. The Bible obviously shows that there's a different way, okay? And tonight, obviously being, when someone offends you, all right, a lot of times humanly, our human nature is that we want to get back, right? We want to, an eye for an eye. We want to exact vengeance and so forth. But we know that the Bible tells us otherwise. Ye ought rather to forgive. Now, biblical forgiveness is, and here's, if you want to write this down, here's 3 words to describe biblical forgiveness. It's complete, meaning it's not simply saying, oh yeah, I forgive you, but you're still kind of holding on to it a little bit. No, it's a complete I forgive you completely, not just for some things. No, I completely forgive you for what you've wronged me for. It's unconditional, all right, meaning it's not, oh, I forgive you now because you've asked me for forgiveness first. Okay, that's not always how it plays out. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely if the people that offend us ask us to forgive them first and then we can forgive them? But we understand that's not how it always plays out. But the Bible, God understands that if you always hold out for the other person to ask forgiveness first, guess what you're never really going to do? Forgive. And guess what you're holding on to? That anger, that angst against that person. And as the Bible says, it becomes a root of bitterness that if you're not careful, it's going to grow and it's going to affect everything in your life. So it's not conditional, it's unconditional. Even if they haven't asked for forgiveness, even if they don't seem to have repented of what they've done against you, it's unconditional. And lastly, it's continual. Okay? Meaning, all because you said it one day, and maybe a couple months down the line, something happens that just reminds you of what they did, and you're like, you know what? Oh man, I actually do hate them. No. It's a continual forgiveness. Okay? It's not just when things are going okay in your life. Oh yeah, I can forgive them, but then when things start to go wrong, it's, you know what? Forget them. I don't care about them anymore. You guys follow the idea? It's easy to forgive when, all right, things are going okay in life. Okay, but when things start to fall down, what's going to be brought up to your mind a lot of times is going to be everything else that's going wrong or who has wronged you in the past. No, it's complete, unconditional, and continual. Now, understand, when we're going to talk about forgiveness, okay, this doesn't mean, because obviously there's a wide spectrum of things and offenses that could happen that require forgiveness, right? Now, this doesn't mean that there are no things that, let me put it this way. This does not mean there are no legal or relational consequences for offenses, right? We know we live in a sin-cursed world. We know there are terrible and devious things that happen all the time that need to face the consequences for, justice for. All right, so when I talk about the need for forgiveness, I'm not talking about, a simple washing away of anything that anybody's done. All right, we understand there are very grievous, devious, big things that happen that need to have those consequences, that need justice meted out, whether it's through the legal system or in other ways, okay? But the larger principle is that when we forgive, all right, we release the right to pay back, quote unquote, or to exact revenge. Remember, the Bible says vengeance is whose? Mine, saith the Lord. It's God. Leave it to God. All right? When the legal system has, enacted the justice that's due for whatever the case may be, all right, you leave that to them. You leave that to the legal system. You leave it to God. You do not want to have yourself continually burdened by the thought of exacting your own justice for whatever wrong has been done to you. Now, thankfully, for many people, and I could say for many of you in this room, that's not going to be something that's going to happen on like a weekly basis, all right? Praise the Lord. All right? It may happen. I pray it doesn't happen to you guys in the future, or if it has happened to you in the past, I pray it doesn't happen again. But what we're talking about is a lot of those day-to-day relational type offenses that happen, whether it's in the church, in the workplace, and so forth, and how it's better to forgive. You ought rather to forgive than to hold on to the wrongs that were done to you. All right, now go back to the book of Genesis, like chapter 45 or so, because we're going to look at the example of who's the main person being talked about at the end of the book of Genesis? Joseph. Obviously, we know Joseph has had a lot of things happen to him, but at the end of Joseph's life, he forgave. His brothers did these terrible things, and yet Joseph still was able to forgive his brothers. So we're going to look at the life of Joseph, how he forgave, and some things that we can hopefully apply to our lives when it comes to forgiveness. And a lot of these things, and you can see in the phrases, when I have forgiven, I blank, a lot of these things are going to help you realize, if I truly have forgiven this person, then I'm not going to do this thing, or I'm going to be like this. Okay, so if you go through this and maybe you're thinking, you know what, I feel that way about that person or this person still, then you might not have forgiven them. Okay, it's very easy for us to tell us in our minds, like, yeah, I don't care anymore. I don't care. I forgive him, whatever. But then when we go over this lesson, you might notice, oh, but that's something I'm still kind of holding on to. Okay, you'll understand as we get into it. But help me out, class. Really quickly, an overview of Joseph's life. Somebody raise your hand. Just name me one thing about Joseph. All right, Locke.
He was his father's favorite.
He was his father's favorite. So which led to, as we understand, it led to a very dysfunctional family home. All right, he had 11 brothers. I don't know how many sisters he had, but he at least had 11 brothers. And he was the second to youngest. And out of all of them, he was his father's favorite. All right, now some of you guys may believe your parents have favorites. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But in general, for you guys, when you do become when you become parents yourself, I know. When you become parents yourself, all right, you do not want to play the favorites game. All right, it might be human nature too, but as much as you can, you do not want to do that because it does cause strife. It causes dysfunction, and it definitely did that in Joseph's family. All right, and you can go back before Joseph's family with Jacob. His father also played favorites with Isaac. Isaac's father, Abraham, also played favorites as well. It's not a good thing. All right, but because they played favorites, someone raise your hand. What did his brothers end up doing to Joseph? Rebecca? Yeah, they didn't just pick on him. They threw him in a pit. All right. Now, initially, they threw him in the pit because they wanted to kill him. But they decided, we're not going to do that, and instead sold him to slavery instead, which, yeah, not that much better of a thing to do. All right, so he went from being his father's favorite, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, eventually ends up where, class? Well, I was going to say Egypt, but yeah, Egypt, sold into Potiphar's house. But even as he got into Potiphar's house, and this is a whole different lesson, he didn't let these things keep him down. He he still trusted in God, and he was a good servant in Potiphar's house. All right, he was a good slave, and because of his hard work ethic, we see that he was risen to a very high position in Potiphar's house, to the point that he knew more about Potiphar's belongings and his money and what was happening than even Potiphar himself. But someone raise your hand. What happened in Potiphar's house? Ethan.
Potiphar's wife tried to get him to have an affair with
Yeah, Potiphar's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, saw him to be a good-looking man, and tried to have an affair with him. Joseph, though, said, "No, I cannot do this and sin against my God," and he ran away, but she ended up lying about the whole deal, and then Joseph got thrown into prison. All right, again, so he kind of goes, he starts off his father's favorite, boom, he has a big betrayal, this terrible thing happens, sold into slavery. He rises up, he's in a good position, things are going well for him, you think, and then boom, he's lied about, he's thrown into prison. But then again, he rises back up, he's doing well, and he's almost like the keeper of the prison. He's still a prisoner, but he's trusted and so forth, and he eventually helps the baker and the butler of Pharaoh's, and who had their dreams, and we need to do this quickly. He interprets these dreams for the Pharaoh's butler and for Pharaoh's baker, interprets them correctly. Butler ends up living, and he asks him, "Hey, remember me when you go to Pharaoh so I can get out of here," and so forth. And the butler forgets about it for a couple years. All right, great guy. He forgets about it, but then Pharaoh himself has a dream, what ends up being 7 years of famine, or plenty, 7 years of famine, but he doesn't know that, so he needs someone to interpret it. Pharaoh's butler, finally remembers Joseph at that time, tells him about Joseph, and all that to say, eventually, Joseph rises again to eventually become the second most powerful man in the world at that time. Why? Because he was second in command to Pharaoh, because he interpreted the dream correctly, comes up with a plan to help save not just Egypt, but much of the world alive. That's said in Genesis chapter 50. And he rises again. And then you get to the whole point where he finally sees his brothers again. And this, guys, understand, when Joseph was first thrown and sold in as a slave, he was probably, many scholars believe, around 17 years old. And by the time his brothers finally come back, well, not come back, but finally meet Joseph again, it's been 22 years. All right? That's a long time. You guys aren't even that old, all right? It's been 22-year span. And you may not change a lot from the time you're 25 to 45 necessarily, but from the time you're a teenager and 22 years later, a lot of things change. They didn't recognize Joseph, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that the Jews and Hebrews, they liked, to grow their beards and so forth. The Egyptians were very much about being clean-shaven and a lot of, makeup and whatnot. But anyway, they didn't recognize Joseph. And you guys know how it goes. Joseph put forth a couple tests, but ultimately he forgives his brothers, all right? And he's reunited with his family. All right, a lot of that background. Let's get into it. Point number one, he forgives his family. When I have forgiven, I don't gossip about you. All right, so just think about that for a second. If you think you have forgiven someone, like, all right, I don't care about it, I'm not going to let it bother me anymore, just think about that. Do I still talk or gossip about that person in a negative way? All right, because if that's the case, you might not have forgiven that person. See, after Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers and they all reconciled and they're glad to be together again, understand others in the palace heard about this reunion. Look at Genesis chapter 45, verse 16. It says, "And the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house." So this whole thing that happened, that Joseph, the second in command, his family, they're reunited. "And the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brethren are come, and it," what's the next word, class? "And it" what? "It pleased Pharaoh well and his servants." Okay? Pharaoh and his servants were pleased by this, right, Josiah? Amadeus? All right, pay attention, guys. They were pleased by this fact, okay? Do you imagine they would have been pleased by it or heard that Joseph's brothers were there if Joseph, for the past 9 years he was in the palace, was talking about how terrible his brothers were and the evil things his brothers did unto him? No, it's probably more likely that if one was aware of the situation that happened, they more than likely would have been like, "Oh, his brothers are here? Let's cast them into prison. Oh, let's give them what they deserve. They did what to Joseph?" So it could be surmised that, you know what? Joseph probably didn't spend the last 9, maybe even the last 20 so years talking about how terrible and all the malicious things his brothers did. Why? Because he lived in forgiveness. Okay? It's not specifically stated in the Bible, but guys, Joseph would not have risen to the places he did continually, even after being brought low, high up in Potiphar's house, high up in the prison, high up in the land of Egypt, if he always lived with a very bitter, angry attitude for what happened to him in the past? He probably would have just quit, understanding he was just a slave, and just been like, I don't care anymore. All right, but he didn't. All right, Joseph's forgiveness was so complete that he had not spent all his time in the palace disparaging his brothers. Oh, how terrible those people back in the land of Canaan were. Someone find for me really quickly Ephesians 4:31 to 32. Or if you know by memory, you can say that too. Lock.
Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you.
Yeah, put away the bitterness, put away the anger, and forgive. See, one of the indicators that we have not forgiven others, even though we might say we have, is that it constantly comes out in our speech. All right? We can't help but, yeah, I've forgiven Mercy for what she did, but man, guys, you know what Mercy did to me back? Mercy's so... Does that show you've forgiven that person? No. Okay? When I have forgiven, I don't gossip about you. Now, again, understand, there are times when you need to share what you have experienced. Say if you went through a very traumatic situation, all right, with a licensed person or with a good, godly friend, or someone you trust, okay? But the goal should be to keep it confidential and directed towards healing and towards forgiveness, not a vent session. And sometimes we deceive ourselves in thinking like, I just need to talk to somebody about it. But what really is happening is you're not just talking to somebody, you end up talking to a bunch of people. And it's not about any confidentiality. It's not about the goal of trying to, heal from it or seek reconciliation. It's just, I want other people to know how bad that person is as well. You guys see the difference there? All right. When I've forgiven, I don't gossip about you. Number 2, when I have forgiven, I am not bothered being around you. Okay? If you say you have forgiven someone, yet you can't stand being in their presence, there might be a problem there. Okay? When Joseph's brothers showed up, he did not ignore them or avoid them. In fact, he went out of his way eventually to provide a place for them to live. All right, he went through a couple tests before that, but he did not simply ignore them. It could have been very easy for the second most powerful man in the world to just assign, those Hebrews from Canaan to a underling. Hey, take care of them, and gone his own separate way. But he didn't do that. He wanted to seek to forgive them. He wanted to see if they've grown, and he sought to reconcile with them. And when as time went on and they finally brought his brother and so forth and everybody else along, and he revealed himself, the first thing he wanted to do was to provide for them a home. Look at chapter 45 again, verse 4. It says, and Joseph said unto his brethren, come near to me. So the opposite of avoiding. He says, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. He's like, hey, don't go away from come near to me. When we are harboring an unforgiving spirit, we tend to clam up and avoid the people who have wronged us. Okay, so if you say you have forgiven someone, all right, yet you kind of have an attitude or a spirit of like, I don't want anything to do with that person, you probably didn't forgive them. There should not be anything in our hearts that would make us unwilling to be in the mere presence of someone we have quote unquote forgiven. All right, now again, there may be particular situations, okay, those grievous, devious situations where, hey, it's better for you to obviously be separated from whatever, in like cases of abuse and stuff. It's the wise thing to be, hey, you need to be away from that person. That's not what I'm talking about here, all right? Consider this. Adam and Eve, when they sinned against God, when they committed the first sin against God in the Garden of Eden, all right, when God came about, what did they do? They hid, all right? Were they the ones that were offended, though? No, they were the ones that did the offending. They were the offender. They sinned against God, but they hid. All right, but God, however, we see in that situation, we see God's willingness to forgive. Yes, he metes out the consequences for their actions. All right, but he also gives the promise of the Messiah at that time. All right, remember he says there will come one of the seed of woman that will, Satan will bruise his heel, but he'll crush the serpent's head, as he says. So he gives them hope. He forgives and he restores proximity to them. All right, he calls Adam out. Hey, come out from hiding. He kills an innocent animal to cover up their nakedness, all right, because they didn't know what to do, because they never realized they were naked before at that time, their shame, all right? And we see that's what Christ did for us on the cross as well, all right? Instead of, sin, which offends God, we are the offenders, and God saying, all right, I don't want anything to do with you. We see God do the opposite, where he sent his son down to earth to die for us on the cross, okay, so that he can reconcile that relationship with us. To all those that trust Christ as their Savior, right? They experience that reconciliation with him. It's the opposite of ignoring. It's the definition of embracing and forgiving. You guys see the difference there? So if you have forgiven, okay, you shouldn't have this attitude of like, you know what, I can't bother being around that person. You guys follow that? All right. Number 3, when I have forgiven, I desire what is best for you. All right, that's simple. If you've forgiven someone, all right, you're not constantly wishing that they get the short end of the stick. Okay? Yeah, I've forgiven you, but I still want to, or actually probably a better way to put it for a lot of people today. If you've forgiven someone, okay, you're not constantly checking your social feed about like what's going on in their life and trying to almost, without even knowing, measuring up, I think I'm still doing better. All right? Guys, that's really petty. Okay? If you've forgiven that person, it shouldn't bother you. And I will tell you a practical thing, okay? If you have a struggle, all right, with somebody who has hurt you or offended you or something like that, you know what you don't have to do? You don't have to follow them, okay? You don't have to follow them on social media or anything like that. But don't be caught up in this thing of trying to always measure what's going on in their life. Am I doing better? And being happy when things aren't going as good for... No, that's not living in forgiveness. See, Joseph... Let me ask you guys this. How could Joseph have sought to do the worst for his brothers when they came to Egypt looking for more food? All right, Grace. He been like, nah, none for you. No food for you. No soup for you. Gage.
Execution time.
Execution time. He's like, you know what? You guys offended me. He had that power. All right, he could have easily, when his brothers showed up, he could have just easily pretended to be okay with them so he could reunite with his father whom he loved, and then he could have just made his brothers his slaves. All right? He could have done all those things, but he didn't. No, he desired the best for them. Look at in chapter 45, look at verse 10. It says, and this is Joseph talking to them. He says, and thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen. Okay, he didn't give them just a house. He gave them a big portion of land in Egypt for them to dwell in, that Pharaoh allowed them to dwell in. Thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me, thou and thy children, and thy children's children, and thy flocks, and thy herds, and all that thou hast. And there will I nourish thee, for yet there are 5 years of famine, lest thou and thy household and all that thou hast come to poverty. So he's saying, so there's 5 more years. Remember, there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. It's only been 2 years of famine. So Joseph not only wanted them to have a place to live, but he wanted to ensure that they were close enough that he could continue to provide them what they needed during this time of famine, all right? He wanted what was best for them. He didn't want to simply, all right, fine, I'm good with you guys, you're forgiven, and send them back to Canaan where they could possibly, again, starve because the famine was affecting the world at that time. An unforgiving spirit desires the worst for others, but a forgiving spirit desires what is best. All right, and then lastly, when I have forgiven, I experience freedom and a blessing. All right, extending our forgiveness to others doesn't always result in restoration. All right, doesn't always result in the goal that we want it to result in, but it does unburden us from that desire for vengeance, from the anger, the stress, the bitterness that we may harbor in ourselves. That's something God does not want you to carry. He wants you to let that go. Let go, let God, vengeance of the Lord, let him handle that and forgive them instead. See, even if Joseph's brothers had been unwilling to reconcile with Joseph, which would have been weird, Joseph would still have experienced the previous blessings of his 2 decades of forgiveness. All right, when even as a slave, he rose up to prominence. Even in prison, he rose up. And even when he was thrown down or forgotten, he eventually rose up as the second in command of Egypt. Look at chapter 41. We'll read one last verse here. Chapter 41, verse 51. So this is, all right, we were in chapter 45. It's when a lot of things are going down with his brothers. He's just forgiven them. This is chapter 41. This is Joseph naming his son. All right. 51 says, and Joseph called the name of the firstborn, his first son, Manasseh, for God, he said, and this is the meaning of his name, for God, he said, hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. Now, what he means there, he doesn't mean like God made me forget everything that happened to me, like he doesn't remember it. All right. That's not what that means. But he says God allowed him not to dwell on that. Hey, forget it. Don't bring it up. How many guys have ever heard the term, forgive and forget? All right. That's what it kind of means. It doesn't mean you all of a sudden erase that from your memory. No, I've forgiven that person. I'm not going to hold it to their account. Whenever I see them, I'm not going to bring it back up to my mind. And Joseph, and this was before he even forgave his brothers, or he decided years before that, you know what? This is not something I'm going to bring up. And he most likely had that attitude way earlier in his life as well in Egypt. Hey, I'm not going to continue to dwell on what my brothers did wrong to me. No, I'm going to forgive, and I'm going to seek to please God in what I'm doing as a slave, as a prisoner, and then eventually as the second in command of Egypt. Okay? That's the freeing experience you can experience when you forgive someone. You're not bringing it up all the time. You're not dwelling upon it. All right? When you dwell upon the offenses someone's done against you, you're like a rocking chair. You're doing some stuff, but you're not going anywhere. You guys follow that? That's what it means there. All right? When I have forgiven, I don't gossip about you. When I have forgiven, I am not bothered being around you. When I have forgiven, I desire what is best for you. When I have forgiven, I experience freedom and blessing. You ought rather to forgive.